the silence before the storm. There are secrets that governments keep for years, carefully buried, meticulously protected, surrounded by layers of denial and misdirection, so thick that the truth becomes almost mythological, something people suspect but cannot prove, something analysts theorize about but cannot confirm. And then there are secrets that keep themselves right up until the moment they don't. This is a story about the second kind. The year is 2024. The Middle East is burning in the way that only the Middle East can burn multiple fires, multiple actors, multiple agendas, all overlapping in a geography so small and so historically loaded that every spark has the potential to become a conflagration. The Gaza conflict is consuming international attention. The Red Sea shipping lanes are under attack from Houthi forces in Yemen. Hezbollah and Israel are exchanging fire across the Lebanese border with an intensity that has not been seen in years. Iraq's Iran-backed militias are launching drone and rocket attacks on American bases across the region. To the casual observer, these look like separate fires, separate conflicts with separate causes and separate actors. They are not separate. They are, according to years of intelligence analysis, diplomatic reporting, and military observation, components of a single strategic architecture, a coordinated system of pressure designed and maintained by one country, deployed across multiple fronts through multiple proxies, aimed at a single overarching objective. That country is Iran. And the strategic architecture, the plan that connects the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the militias in Iraq and Syria, and the naval forces in the Persian Gulf has a name inside Iran's military establishment. It is called the axis of resistance. And the military doctrine that governs how this axis operates, how it escalates and de-escalates, how it coordinates and communicates, how it is funded and armed and directed, that doctrine has been, for years, one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps until a Tuesday morning in late 2024, when it stopped being a secret at all. Chapter 1, the plan that nobody was supposed to see. To understand what was exposed, you first need to understand what Iran had actually built over the preceding 4 decades. The Islamic Republic of Iran has been under various forms of international sanctions and military pressure since 1979. Faced with adversaries, primarily the United States and Israel, that possess conventional military superiority it cannot match, Iran made a strategic decision early in its existence. It would not try to compete on the conventional battlefield. It would not try to build an air force or a navy or an armored corps capable of defeating American or Israeli forces in direct confrontation. That path was too expensive, too technologically demanding, and ultimately probably impossible. Instead, Iran chose a different path. It would build depth. It would cultivate relationships with non-state actors across the region. It would provide weapons, training, financing, and strategic direction to groups that shared its interest in opposing American and Israeli influence. It would create a situation in which any military action against Iran would automatically trigger responses from multiple directions simultaneously: Lebanon, Gaza, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, making the cost of attacking Iran so high, so complex, and so unpredictable that adversaries would think twice before pulling the trigger. This is not a secret. The broad outlines of this strategy have been publicly discussed by analysts, reported by journalists, and acknowledged by governments for years. Iran does not entirely deny it. Iranian officials speak openly about the axis of resistance as a political concept. What has remained secret, genuinely, carefully, obsessively secret, is the operational detail. The specific communication channels between the IRGC's Quds Force and its proxy networks, the financial routing systems used to move money from Tehran to Beirut to Sana'a to Baghdad without triggering sanctions enforcement, the weapons transfer logistics, the maritime routes, the land corridors, the front companies used to move missiles and drones and ammunition across international borders, the command structure, who gives orders, through what channels, using what protocols, with what degree of direct Iranian control versus proxy autonomy. The escalation thresholds, the specific conditions under which Iran instructs its proxies to escalate, hold, or stand down, the targeting criteria, the principles governing which targets are authorized, which are forbidden, what the red lines are. This is the information that every intelligence agency in the world wants and very few possess in complete form. This is the information that would allow Israel to accurately assess whether a Hezbollah action represents an autonomous decision or a direct Iranian instruction. This is the information that would allow American military planners to predict how Iran would respond to a strike on its nuclear facilities. This is the information that could, in the wrong hands, start a war, or in the right hands, potentially prevent one. This is what was accidentally exposed. Chapter 2, the exposure. The mechanism of the exposure was not dramatic. It was not a daring intelligence operation. It was not a defector with a briefcase full of documents crossing a checkpoint at midnight. It was not a cyber attack that cracked open a classified server. It was, in the most ironic and deflating way possible, a communication error. Inside the IRGC's Quds Force, operational communications are conducted through a layered system of encrypted channels, couriers, and intermediaries. The system is designed with redundancy and compartmentalization, no single point of failure, no single person who knows everything, no single communication that contains the full picture. It is a system built by people who have spent decades thinking about how to prevent exactly what was about to happen. But systems are operated by humans, and humans, under pressure, under time constraints, under the accumulated fatigue of managing multiple simultaneous crises across multiple countries, make mistakes. A senior Quds Force coordinator managing communications across 3 separate proxy networks simultaneously during a period of heightened operational activity made a routing error. A document package, a coordination brief containing operational parameters, communication protocols, financial transfer instructions, and escalation guidelines across multiple fronts was sent through an unsecured channel to a recipient who was not its intended destination. The recipient was not an enemy intelligence officer. They were not a journalist or a dissident. They were a mid-level administrator in an Iran-aligned organization in the region, someone within the trusted network, but far below the level of clearance that would normally have access to this kind of strategic overview document. That administrator, not fully understanding what they had received, forwarded it to a colleague for clarification. That colleague forwarded it to someone else. The document moved through 3 more hands over the course of 18 hours before it reached someone who understood exactly what it was and exactly how dangerous its exposure would be. By that point, the document had also, through a chain of events that remains partially unclear, reached someone with connections outside the network. Not an intelligence agency directly, a journalist, a specific journalist who worked for a regional media outlet with connections to multiple governments and a history of careful, serious reporting on Iranian military affairs. The journalist understood immediately what they were holding. They also understood the extraordinary danger of publishing it, the extraordinary importance of verifying it, and the extraordinary responsibility of deciding what to do with it. They spent 4 days consulting with editors, legal advisors, and trusted sources who could help authenticate the material. On the 5th day, they published Chapter 3, The World Reacts. The publication landed at 6:23 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. By 6:45, it had been picked up by 3 major international wire services. By 7:30, it was the lead story on every serious news outlet covering the Middle East. By 9, it had reached the desks of senior officials in Washington, Tel Aviv, London, Riyadh, and Ankara. By noon, the internet had completely lost its mind. The document itself was dense, technical, and not easy reading for a general audience. But within hours, analysts and journalists had begun translating its contents into accessible summaries. These summaries spread across social media with a speed and reach that no academic paper or intelligence report ever achieves. By the end of the first day, the essential contents of Iran's most sensitive operational document were being discussed by millions of people who a week earlier could not have identified the Quds Force on a labeled diagram. The reaction split along predictable lines, but with unusual intensity. Israeli officials, speaking on background to journalists, described the publication as extraordinarily significant. Sources within Israeli military intelligence, while refusing to confirm or deny what they had previously known, indicated that the document contained details that matched, extended, and in some cases corrected their existing understanding of Iranian proxy coordination. One analyst with close government connections described it as the single most comprehensive window into Iranian operational doctrine that had ever entered the public domain. American officials were more cautious in their public statements, but unmistakably energized in their private ones. Congressional leaders with Intelligence Committee memberships began requesting classified briefings. The State Department issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging concern about the implications of the document's contents without confirming its authenticity. The Pentagon said nothing publicly, which in Washington is itself a form of statement. Iran's official response went through several stages in rapid succession. The initial response was flat denial. The document was fabricated. It was a Zionist production. It was American disinformation designed to justify aggression against the Islamic Republic. The Iranian Foreign Ministry summoned the ambassadors of several countries for what were described as formal protests. The denial was followed, within 48 hours, by a more nuanced position. Certain elements of the document might have been real, but they had been taken out of context, selectively presented, and misrepresented in ways that distorted their meaning. Iran was a sovereign nation with the right to maintain relationships with regional allies. There was nothing in Iranian law or international law that prohibited such relationships. This second position was essentially an acknowledgement that the document was authentic, expressed in the particular diplomatic language that governments use when they need to acknowledge something without explicitly admitting it. The third position, which emerged several days later, was silence. Iranian officials stopped talking about the document. State media stopped covering it. The subject was changed. This is the classic final stage of official damage control. Having failed to destroy the story with denial or dilute it with contextualization, simply stop feeding it oxygen and hope the news cycle moves on. The news cycle, for once, did not fully cooperate. Chapter 4, What the Document Actually Revealed. Setting aside the political reaction and the media noise, the substance of what was exposed deserves serious examination, because the details matter. They matter for understanding how Iran actually operates, how the regional conflicts of the past several years are actually connected, and what the implications are for stability in a region that has been on the edge of wider war for years. The document revealed, in operational detail, the command and control structure connecting the IRGC Quds Force to its major proxy networks. It showed that the relationship between Tehran and these groups is not simply one of arms supply and general encouragement, as Iran publicly maintains. It is a relationship of structured operational coordination, regular communication, shared planning, coordinated timing of actions across different fronts, and direct Iranian input into targeting decisions at specific escalation thresholds. This distinction matters enormously. Iran has consistently maintained that Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias are independent actors who make their own decisions. The document suggested a far more integrated picture, one in which Iranian advisors are embedded at senior levels of these organizations, in which major operational decisions require consultation with Quds Force leadership, and in which the escalation and de-escalation of activity across multiple fronts is coordinated to achieve unified strategic effects. The financial architecture revealed in the document was particularly striking to analysts focused on sanctions enforcement. The routing of funds through a web of front companies, sympathetic financial institutions in jurisdictions with limited oversight, cryptocurrency transactions, and physical cash transfers had been theorized but not documented in this detail. The document provided a partial but unusually specific map of how money moves from Iranian government budgets through multiple layers of intermediaries to reach operational budgets for proxy activities across the region. The weapons transfer logistics section detailed maritime routes through the Arabian Sea and Red Sea, land corridors through Iraq and Syria, and the role of specific ports and border crossings in transferring weaponry. Some of these routes were already known to Western intelligence. Others were not. The combination of maritime and land-based transfer mechanisms and the specific choke points identified as critical to the system gave military planners a level of detail about Iran's weapons supply architecture that had not previously been publicly available. Perhaps most sensitive was the section on escalation doctrine, the internal guidelines governing under what conditions Iran instructs its proxies to escalate military activities, under what conditions it instructs restraint, and what the specific triggers are for different levels of response. This section, more than any other, was described by analysts as genuinely operationally significant. It provided a window into Iranian strategic thinking that could theoretically allow adversaries to predict Iranian behavior with considerably greater accuracy. Or depending on how Iran responded to the exposure, it could make Iranian behavior considerably less predictable, as the regime was now forced to abandon compromised protocols and build new ones. The aftermath and the new reality. In the weeks following the publication, a series of changes rippled through Iran's regional network that were visible to anyone paying close attention. Communication patterns shifted. Intelligence agencies tracking encrypted communications between Iranian nodes and proxy organizations observed changes in protocol, frequency, and channel. This was expected. Any competent organization responds to a compromised communication system by changing the system. What was notable was the speed and scope of the changes, which suggested the document had exposed more than Iran was publicly acknowledging. Personnel movements occurred in several organizations affiliated with the Axis of Resistance. Individuals in coordination roles who were referenced or implied in the document were moved to less exposed positions. Some disappeared from view entirely, reassigned to roles with no visible external footprint. Operational tempo changed. In the immediate weeks following the publication, activity from several Iran-linked groups decreased noticeably. This was interpreted by analysts as a period of reassessment, a pulling back to evaluate what had been compromised, what needed to change, and what the exposure meant for ongoing operations. Diplomatic activity accelerated quietly in back channels. Several countries that had been serving as intermediaries between Iran and Western governments reported increased Iranian interest in communication, a pattern that suggested Tehran was attempting to assess through diplomatic channels exactly how much the document had damaged its position and what the likely responses from adversaries would be. But the most significant aftermath was not operational. It was political, and it played out not in the region, but in capitals far from the Middle East. The document exposure arrived at a moment when several Western governments were engaged in intense internal debates about how to respond to Iranian proxy activity. In Washington, there had been deep disagreement between those who argued for more aggressive responses to Iranian-backed attacks and those who feared escalation into a wider regional war. The document, by providing concrete evidence of the integrated nature of Iranian command and control, shifted the terms of that debate in ways that were not immediately visible to the public, but were very visible to the people making the decisions. In Israel, the document's revelations about Hezbollah's relationship to Tehran added a new dimension to calculations about how to address the threat from Lebanon. The question of whether a strike on Hezbollah would or would not constitute a de facto attack on Iran and therefore trigger a direct Iranian response was a central uncertainty in Israeli military planning. The document did not resolve that uncertainty, but it provided more data points for the analysis. In Riyadh, a government that had spent years navigating the complex relationship between its formal Saudi state interests and the informal networks of regional competition found the document useful in ways it did not publicly acknowledge. The detailed picture of Iranian regional architecture was intelligence that Saudi planners could use regardless of how it had been obtained. And in Tehran, behind the official silence and the formal denials, a reckoning was underway. Not a public reckoning. The Iranian government does not do public reckonings, but an internal one. The questions being asked in closed rooms in the IRGC were serious and not easily answered. How had a document of this sensitivity left the controlled environment in which it was supposed to exist? Who was responsible? What was the full extent of the damage? What needed to be rebuilt? And how quickly could it be rebuilt? And underneath all of those operational questions, a more fundamental one. In a world where a single routing error can expose 4 decades of carefully constructed strategic architecture to global scrutiny within 48 hours, what does operational security actually mean anymore? That question did not have a comfortable answer. It does not have one now, because the truth that Iran's accidental exposure illustrated, the same truth that Russia's failed missile test illustrated, that every government that has tried and failed to contain damaging information in the digital age has been forced to confront, is that the architecture of secrecy built in the 20th century was designed for a different world. A world without smartphones, without commercial satellite imagery available to civilians, without open source intelligence communities that can geolocate a photograph within minutes, without social media platforms that can carry a document from a single regional outlet to 50 million readers in the time it takes a government spokesperson to draft a denial. The Iranian plan was dangerous. The exposure was accidental. The consequences were real, ongoing, and not yet fully resolved. But the lesson that sits underneath all of it, the lesson that applies not just to Iran, but to every actor in every conflict who still believes that operational secrecy is achievable in the way it once was, is the same lesson that keeps appearing in different forms in different places, with different specifics. Secrets have always been difficult to keep. They have never been more difficult than they are right now. And the gap between what governments believe they can conceal and what the connected world can find, share, and remember is growing wider every year. Iran's most dangerous military plan was accidentally exposed. The world saw it, and nothing after that was quite the same.